My name is Maya Caldwell. I'm 27 years old, and last weekend, my younger sister Cassidy, Air Force officer, family golden child, and resident queen of subtle digs, looked across a table full of decorated military guests at my cousin's wedding and said, "She's just my sister." Civilian. Then something strange happened. Her commanding officer, Colonel David Sterling, paused. Mid-sip, turned to me with precise calculation and asked me a question I can't repeat here. Seconds later, he stood at full attention and saluted me. In front of everyone. Before I can continue my story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that looked charming, from the outside American flag by the front door, neatly trimmed hedges and wind chimes that chimed like a lullaby of order. But inside the atmosphere was more boot camp than bedtime story. My dad, Colonel Thomas Caldwell, had retired from the Marine Corps before I was born, but the house still ran on reveille. My mom, Linda, was a Navy nurse during Desert Storm, sweet but efficient. Her love shone through pressed laundry and hot meals. There was order in everything, Sunday inspection routines, weekly meal preps that looked like logistics briefs, and bedtime enforced by rank, not rhythm. Then there was Cassidy. 2 years younger, infinitely louder. She was built for the family mythos athletic magnetic brave in a way that showed. I still remember her at age 8, leading a neighborhood game of capture the base barking commands like a junior general. Dad loved her for it. She could do no wrong in his eyes, and the admiration was mutual. He taught her hand-to-hand drills in the backyard, while I studied vocabulary flashcards alone in my room, wishing he'd once ask me about the countries I could now name capitals for in 6 languages. To the outside world, we were picture perfect. Inside, I felt like the family placeholder. Not rebellious enough to be the problem child, not shiny enough to be the pride. Just quietly competent. Forgettable. Cassidy's victories were framed on the wall, trophy certificates, glossy 5/7s in uniform. Mine, my name occasionally made it into the school newsletter for debate team or academic decathlon, but no one saved those clippings. My childhood was a slow bleed of being told that book smarts don't save lives, that real courage is boots on the ground. It didn't matter how well I performed academically. To my family, if I wasn't in uniform, I wasn't contributing. I was tolerated, not celebrated. Still, I watched. I learned to live between the lines. And I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were other ways to serve, quieter ways that didn't require medals to be meaningful. Cassidy called me a civilian last weekend, like it was an insult, like service only wears camo. But the man standing beside her knew better. And as I stood under the soft chandelier light in that reception hall, I felt years of invisibility cracking just slightly around the edges. There's a particular scent I associate with my childhood polished oak and leather-bound rules. Our home in Somerville wasn't a shrine in the religious sense, but in every other way, it was a temple to military order and tradition. My father's dress blues hung in a garment bag in the hall closet like a relic. His medals lived in a cherrywood shadow box on the mantel, illuminated by a small brass lamp. He never spoke of his deployments unless asked, but his silence carried weight. Reverence. That same gravity extended to every Caldwell ritual bed made with hospital corners, weekend chore lists, with itemized tasks, and even sir or ma'am tacked onto basic answers, until we were old enough to question and disciplined enough not to. The walls of our home told a clear story. Cassidy, my younger sister, was its heroine. Her photos took up most of the family room wall, her winning a taekwondo match. Cassidy in JROTC, Cassidy at the Air Force Academy's orientation camp, arms crossed with military stoicism. There were no photos of me at Model UN, no certificates from my Arabic language competitions. I used to joke that I was the civilian wallpaper. No one laughed. Cassidy was born for that world. Even as a toddler, she had a fire in her eyes that lit up when she competed. She'd run laps around our backyard until Dad would finally wave a stopwatch and tell her she beat her previous record. He grinned when she did push-ups at 7 dead serious. He was invested. With me, he'd nod politely when I brought home straight A's, then ask what time dinner was. Mom tried to bridge the gap. She'd pack my lunch with notes in the early years, small affirmations like, "Proud of you, kiddo," or "You're stronger than you think." But she deferred to Dad in everything else. When I once asked her why Cassidy got to skip dishes every time she had drills, but I had to do mine before calculus study sessions, she just smiled sadly and said, "It's different for her." You understand, don't you? I didn't. Not then. It wasn't just about favoritism. It was about values. Our family measured worth in sacrifice action grit. And I was contemplative. I was the girl who spent hours decoding language patterns, memorizing the geopolitics of Southeast Asia for fun. I built narratives, connections, meaning. But to them, that was soft power. Maybe even no power. I remember one night in high school, I just won first place in the state debate championship. I came home holding the trophy like it was a passport to recognition. Cassidy had sprained her ankle at drill practice that same day. Guess which story dominated dinner? That night, I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan spin like a slow metronome. Something hardened inside me, not resentment exactly. Something quieter, a kind of steel. I didn't want to outshine Cassidy. I just wanted to be seen on my own terms. I started practicing silence, not the passive kind, but the kind that listens, that learns, that waits. And by the time I was 17, I already knew if I was ever going to make an impact, it wouldn't be by shouting over my family's ideals. It would be by proving one day that there are different kinds of warriors. I found my sanctuary in books. Not the escapist kind with wizards or alternate universes, though I read those too, but the dense ones. The kinds of books that demanded focus, that layered meaning through implication and silence. Intelligence histories, post-colonial theory, transcripts of declassified negotiations. I read them like other girls dissected fashion magazines, annotating the margins, circling connections. Cassidy could dismantle and reassemble a rifle in under 90 seconds. I could break down a UN resolution and identify the unspoken leverage points hidden between the verbs. It wasn't impressive to anyone at home, but I clung to it. By junior year of high school, I was fluent in Arabic and working on conversational Mandarin. I enrolled in community college courses at night while still in AP classes during the day. Georgetown and Yale started mailing me brochures before senior year. Dad thought they were junk mail. Cassidy, meanwhile, was being recruited early for the Air Force Academy. When the acceptance letter came, Dad threw a party. Real Streamer's neighbors invited pound cake with aim high, written in frosting. When I got into Duke's School of International Affairs with a full ride, Mom baked muffins and told me how proud she was quietly in the kitchen where no one else heard. I didn't protest. I'd stopped expecting celebration years ago. But what I started doing was documenting, internally. I kept records of who asked what, who praised whom, not out of bitterness, but clarity. I needed to understand the system I'd grown up in, not just to survive it, but because I knew someday I'd have to navigate others like it. My essays won national contests. My Arabic professor pulled me aside after a mock translation test and said, "You're the first person I've met who thinks in Arabic instead of just translating it." He thought it was a compliment. I took it as confirmation. While Cassidy moved into cadet housing and learned survival tactics, I was pulling 16-hour days studying political insurgencies, border intelligence, and negotiation frameworks. I wasn't competing with her. Not really. I was building something separate, something I didn't yet have the vocabulary for. It was during one of those long nights, 3 a.m. My dorm window cracked the buzz of streetcars humming in the distance, that I wrote in my journal, "I will never win medals. But one day, I'll walk into a room and the right people will know exactly who I am, even if they can't say it out loud." It felt grandiose then. A stretch. But it comforted me. Because even in a house where I was never the chosen one, I had begun to believe in a version of worth that didn't need applause to be real. I didn't know it yet, but I was being watched. Not by my family, by others. Quiet people in conference rooms. Professors who asked unusual questions. Alumni who lingered after guest lectures, asking if I liked puzzles. One woman, cool, reserved, elegant, in a way that felt deliberate, asked me after a seminar, How do you see information moving in a blackout zone? I answered. Not perfectly, but thoughtfully. She handed me a card with no title, just a number. I didn't call, not yet, but I kept the card. Grandpa Henry Caldwell wasn't like the rest of the family. Where Dad was strict, Henry was still. Where Cassidy demanded attention, he disappeared into the background. He wore plain jackets, kept a collection of old books on global affairs, and smelled like cedarwood and ink. His voice always arrived in low measured tones, like he weighed every word before giving it away. Growing up, I never quite knew what Grandpa did before retiring. The official family line was logistics consultant, a vague term that didn't align with the way military officers snapped to attention when they saw him at VA events. He had a quiet authority that even Dad respected. That said something. Once I caught him reading a Persian newspaper in its native script. I asked him why. He smiled and replied, "To understand what someone really means, you have to hear it in their language." At first, I thought he meant it philosophically. Later, I understood Grandpa Henry spoke fluent Farsi, and probably 5 other languages. He never confirmed. But he always knew things, subtle things, like how to end a conversation before someone said too much, or how to gently redirect suspicion without seeming evasive. I started mimicking him, not to impress anyone, but because it felt safe to learn from someone who seemed to understand my type of quiet. The summer after my freshman year at Duke, he invited me to his cottage by the lake. Just the 2 of us. No Cassidy, no Dad. It was the first time I felt like someone in the family wanted me alone, not to fix me, but to know me. He made tea the old-fashioned way, loose leaves steeped in a kettle. We sat on the porch and listened to the wind roll over the water. After a long silence, he said, "I saw your Arabic translation essay published in the language journal." I blinked. I hadn't told anyone in the family. "I pay attention," he said, eyes never leaving the horizon. We talked. Not much, but enough. He asked questions no one else ever had. Not about my grades, but about my instincts. When you walk into a room, where do your eyes go first? If someone lies with their body but tells the truth with their voice, which do you believe? They weren't academic questions. They were tests. Or maybe invitations. Then he said, "You know, there are people who live their whole lives pretending to be loud, pretending to be brave. But the ones who last, the ones who matter, are the ones who are quiet and real." I nodded, unsure what to say. He looked at me for a long moment, then added, "You're not like your sister. That's your strength, not your failure." That was the first time anyone had said it out loud. When I left the cottage that weekend, he handed me an old paperback in Russian, underlined and annotated with neat handwriting. Inside was a note, "There's a world beneath the world. I think you'll find it." He died 2 years later. At the funeral, I wore black and said nothing. But when I stood at his casket, I slipped that note into my pocket and whispered, "I think I found it, Grandpa." And I think he knew long before I did that I was never just a girl with books. I was training for a war no one could see. Duke was where everything shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like fog rolling in at dusk, soft but insistent, reshaping the world around me until nothing looked the same. My sophomore year, I was tapped for a summer immersion program abroad. The official title was something bland, like Global Linguistic and Cultural Exchange Initiative, co-sponsored by various federal departments. What it really was, I later realized, was a farm team for talent, the kind of program that doesn't advertise broadly, the kind that watches instead of asks. The invitation came by email. No letterhead, no contact person, just a time and a building on campus I'd never entered before. I showed up in neutral clothing, no perfume, no distractions. The room had no sign. Inside were 5 other students, quiet, sharp-eyed, the type who didn't fidget. A woman in her 40s, short gray bob, perfectly pressed navy blazer, introduced herself only as Ms. Avery. She didn't smile much. She didn't need to. She spoke about cultural fluency, discretion systems, thinking. She asked no direct questions. But at the end of the hour, she handed me a manila envelope with a date, a location, and a note. Bring nothing. Arrive alone. I didn't tell anyone. Not my advisor. Not my roommate. Not even my mother. Something in me understood instinctively this was not the kind of opportunity you advertised. The facility they sent me to looked like a corporate retreat center. Pine trees, gravel paths, Sleek conference rooms with whiteboards that wiped too clean. Inside, the training began. Not in languages, though those came later. The first lessons were about observation bias assumption. A man in glasses showed us videos with no sound and asked us to identify the alpha in the group. A woman with a tablet trained us in micro-expressions. There were no tests, just evaluations. Feedback came in strange forms, a nod here, an extended silence there. Later, they escalated. Mock interviews where we were given false identities and thrown into real conversations with locals. Surveillance detection drills in shopping malls where we had to notice who was following us. Night runs through unfamiliar woods where the challenge wasn't speed, it was invisibility. They were building something in us, or perhaps chiseling something away. By the end of the summer, I had received 2 verbal offers, one from a publicly known think tank, the other from a joint interagency opportunity that didn't exist on paper. I chose the second. Senior year, I carried 2 lives. Student by day, shadow trainee by night. My friends thought I was doing a thesis on neurolinguistics. I let them. It explained the late nights, the stress, the way I sometimes flinched when someone approached too quickly. At Christmas that year, Cassidy came home in her cadet blues. Dad beamed. She talked about survival drills and simulated hostage rescues. I talked about international economic structures. "That's nice," Dad said, cutting the roast. "Still doing all that research." "Yes," I said, smiling tightly. "Still doing all that research." That night alone in my childhood bedroom, I opened my encrypted laptop and received my first field assignment location. Not a mission, just an insertion. A name, a cover job, a place. I sat there in the glow of the screen, listening to Cassidy's laughter echo down the hallway. The family had no idea, and that was the point. You don't realize how heavy the truth is until you're trained to carry it without ever setting it down. After graduation, I moved to Arlington, Virginia, under the pretense of working for a multilateral development policy institute. That was the phrase I gave to friends, family, old professors. Technically accurate, entirely misleading. The real job, compartmentalized, classified, and carved from silence. My apartment was plain nondescript. Gray walls, minimalist furniture, a bookshelf with a few strategically placed titles. The Economist, Foreign Affairs, a couple of Russian novels for flair. My neighbors thought I worked in budgeting. Sometimes I let them. Other times I told them I was an analyst for international aid compliance, which always shut down conversation quickly. In truth, I was training harder than ever, 6 days a week. Some of it physical functional strength weapons, handling close quarters evasion. Most of it cognitive. My dialect fluency in Arabic wasn't enough. I had to master regional idioms, socioeconomic slang, and cultural norms to the point of seamless immersion. Same with Farsi, same with Mandarin. The goal wasn't fluency, it was invisibility. One instructor named Rafiq told me during a training debrief, "Language isn't just speech, it's behavior. When you reach for your tea, which hand do you use? How do you pour for others?" That's what makes the difference between tolerated and trusted. It stuck with me. There were other layers too. Secure communications protocols, false identities, operational hand signals, the art of exiting a room without being remembered. I was being crafted into a different kind of operative, less born, more chess master. Not meant to chase, but to notice. Not to dominate, but to blend. It took a toll. The lies piled up. The friendships I'd kept from Duke faded away, not from conflict, but from vagueness. Missed calls, vague texts. The accumulation of silence eroded the connections. It's hard to maintain friendships when every house work feels like a tripwire. I missed Grandpa Henry more during that time than ever. He would have understood the cost, the way the duality burrowed under your skin until you couldn't quite tell where your cover ended and you began. My sister still called sometimes. Her cadet years were over, and she was stationed at a base in Nevada. Her voice over the phone carried that same cadence, sharp, confident, constantly reminding me that she was the real soldier in the family. She never asked about my work, only whether I finally found a job that appreciated spreadsheets. I didn't argue. I gave her exactly what she wanted, boring answers, self-deprecating jokes. I let her win the comparison game. She didn't know we'd stopped playing. The hardest part wasn't the deception. It was how good I got at it. The ease with which I could slip into fake laughter, give the perfect casual reply, spin an entire narrative of a normal life in under 3 sentences. People bought it. Even my parents. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Still me, but quieted, hardened in places I didn't remember building. But underneath all the protocols and aliases, I held on to one truth. Like a talisman, I was making a difference. They would never know, but I would. You train for everything. You're told that preparation is your shield, your currency, your armor. But all it takes is one small break, one human error, one missed cue, and the whole structure crumbles. That lesson was written into my skin one cold spring in Istanbul. I can't tell you the operation's real name, but within the agency, we called it Echo Gate. Our objective was to confirm the legitimacy of a suspected data leak from a regional consulate. Not explosive material yet, but the kind of slow, poisonous leak that compromises networks over time. We were embedded under diplomatic covers, 3 of us. My role was simple: establish contact with an insider who had been flagged for inconsistent travel patterns and financial spikes. Build rapport, vet reliability. If the intel checked out, initiate next-level extraction for the leak and for them. I'd done it before. Dozens of simulations. 2 real-world exercises in lower-threat environments. But this was different. The contact known to us only as Zeynep was younger than expected. Maybe 23, scared, brilliant. Her English was decent, but she relaxed when I spoke Turkish. We met at a tea shop near Galata Tower. Crowded enough to provide cover, but not so loud I couldn't hear her whispers. She brought data encrypted on a burner drive taped under her coffee mug. It was clean, she had real access, and she was being watched. My handler back at the safe flat told me extraction was a go. We initiated Phase 2. I had a 2-hour window to move her across the city to a neutral diplomatic office. What I didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone else inside our own system had flagged the op as compromised. Bureaucratic redundancy. A pause order had been issued just as we were already moving. That's how you end up alone, walking a terrified whistleblower across Istanbul's oldest bridge, with no support and a tale you didn't expect. We were halfway across when I saw them, 2 men, too casual, too precise. I tightened my pace. Zeynep stumbled. "Stay calm," I whispered. "Can you swim?" She blinked. "What?" "Never mind, walk." I made the call. Ghost protocol. No extraction, no fallback. Evade and disappear. We disappeared into the Grand Bazaar trading scarves, dodging alleys, splitting phones and clothes. I ditched my ID and changed languages twice before we reached the tram line. We were supposed to reach the handoff point in 27 minutes. It took 44. Every one of them burned into my memory. When we finally arrived at the diplomatic station, it was Colonel Sterling waiting in civilian clothes. I hadn't known he was in country. He didn't speak. Just nodded once, then took Zeynep's hand and guided her inside. Later in a debrief, I was never supposed to hear someone called my response improvisational excellence under field duress. Sterling used different words, instinct over instruction. She adjusted the mission instead of abandoning it. I didn't care. I couldn't sleep for days. Zeynep was safe, yes, but I'd broken protocol, bent a rule, acted on instinct. That can get people killed, or worse. But it didn't, not this time. A week later, I flew back to Virginia. On the plane, I opened a napkin-wrapped note someone had slipped into my jacket at the safe house. It said in Turkish, "You didn't just save me, you believed me." I cried the moment we hit cruising altitude. No one noticed. That's the thing about this job. You're always invisible, especially when you're falling apart. I almost didn't go. The invitation sat unopened on my kitchen counter for days. Cream cardstock with silver lettering, a neatly printed RSVP line staring back like a dare. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Ryan Caldwell and Elise Carter. Ceremony at Fort Liberty's Officers Club. Military base, military families. Uniforms, salutes, and more commentary about how my soft skills must be useful somewhere. I texted Mom that I'd check my schedule. She called instead. "Cassidy's going to be there, you know, with her CO. It would mean a lot if you came." There was a pause. The kind that carries the weight of all the things she wasn't saying. "I'll be there," I said, and that was that. I prepared the way I would for a field insertion. Travel arrangements, independent of the family block. a private hotel, separate transportation, a neutral-toned navy dress that fit modestly but flattered enough to avoid scrutiny. I rehearsed casual anecdotes about my policy consulting job, made sure I had a half-smile prepared for every predictable question. I told myself it was just another mission. The rehearsal dinner was at a rustic bistro on base brick walls, polished brass fixtures, and the undercurrent buzz of restrained formality. My parents hugged me warmly, as if they hadn't spent years side-eyeing my career path with polite confusion. My extended relatives greeted me with the usual blend of vague curiosity and the assumption I still did something with maps. Then Cassidy arrived. She moved like someone who'd never been questioned, tall, composed, crisp in her off-duty dress, accompanied by 3 officers, and trailing behind them a man I recognized instantly, even though we'd never spoken face-to-face. Colonel David Sterling. It had been over a year since Istanbul. His presence made my stomach tighten, though I gave no outward sign. Introductions were passed around like cocktail napkins. "This is my older sister, Maya Cassidy," said her smile tight and performative. "She's in policy work, civilian stuff." Sterling shook my hand. "Pleasure to meet you," he said. His grip was firm, neutral, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew. Dinner was a blur of clinking silverware and military stories I had no part in. I stayed quiet, observing. Cassidy held court, gesturing as she told some over-polished anecdote about night vision drills and flight simulations. At one point, she said loudly, "It must be nice to have regular hours, right, Maya? Some of us sleep with our boots by the door." A few laughs. Sterling didn't join them. I nodded. Every battlefield has its terrain. That earned a glance from him. A long one. After dinner, as guests moved toward the lounge, I stepped outside for air. I needed space. Needed to shake the feeling that I was back in a family photo where my smile was always slightly too late. Footsteps behind me. Maya Caldwell, Sterling said quietly. "Or should I say, let's not," I replied, eyes still on the horizon. He stepped beside me, hands in his pockets. "You handled Istanbul better than some senior officers I've worked with." That wasn't in the file. I was in the debrief. I remember what mattered. I didn't answer. "She doesn't know, does she?" he asked, nodding back toward the dining room. "No one does, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." He nodded slowly. "Understood." And then just as quietly, just as naturally, he said, "You've been invisible too long." I didn't realize in that moment just how visible I was about to become. The reception hall the next day looked like something out of a recruiting commercial, polished brass American flags, round tables centered with white roses and blue hydrangeas, crystal glasses, dress uniforms, and the buzz of structured celebration. Cassidy looked radiant in her formal blues, the sheen of her medals catching the light every time she moved. She was magnetic, as always, surrounded by officers, cousins, and a few old family friends who treated her like the legacy she'd always been groomed to be. I arrived just after the couple's first dance, wearing the same navy dress from the night before, heels low and deliberate. I kept to my prepared cover, smiling when spoken to, drifting where I could be forgettable. I'd done this before. 1,000 rooms, 1,000 versions of Maya Caldwell analyst. Cassidy found me near the bar, nursing ginger ale. "You clean up nice," she said, sipping wine, eyes sharp. "Still working for... who again?" "One of those agencies that write reports no one reads." "Something like that," I replied evenly. She gave a breathy laugh. "I mean, I get it. Not everyone's cut out for boots on the ground work." Before I could reply, Colonel Sterling approached. His presence changed the room. People straightened. Heads turned. Cassidy brightened like a stage light had clicked on. "Colonel, we were just talking about how different our jobs are. Maya's got the comfy desk gig. She's more of a strategic type, I guess." Sterling gave a neutral smile. "Is that so?" "Oh, yeah," Cassidy continued, tipsy but glowing with confidence. "She's just my sister, civilian, but smart, really smart." Sterling turned to me. "Miss Caldwell," he said, voice even, "I'd like a word." The room stilled. He stepped back, and before anyone could process it, stood at full attention. And then he saluted me. Sharp, formal, regulation perfect. The glass Cassidy was holding tilted in her hand, spilling a splash of white wine down her wrist. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. Sterling held the salute, I returned a barely perceptible nod, the civilian version of acknowledgement. He lowered his hand with precision. Cassidy looked between us. "What the hell was that?" Sterling turned to her calmly. "Lieutenant Caldwell, with respect, your sister has provided exceptional service to this country in ways you do not and cannot currently understand." My father stood nearby, his brow furrowed. "Colonel," Sterling continued without breaking stride. "I can't elaborate further. Classification prohibits details. But I can say this Maya Caldwell has contributed directly to operations that have saved American lives, including those in uniform, including mine." A hush fell across our table. Then the entire section. Conversations ceased. Forks paused mid-air. The DJ awkwardly adjusted volume, sensing tension, but unsure of its cause. Cassidy turned pale. "Wait, you know her from—" "I know her work," Sterling said. "And I respect it." My parents stared at me. Mom's eyes brimmed with confusion and dawning realization. Dad looked like someone had just reordered the world's chain of command. I stood still, spine straight, heart pounding. I didn't want this. Not here. Not like this. But it was happening anyway. "I think we should let the newlyweds enjoy their night," I said quietly, gently redirecting. Sterling nodded. "Of course." He stepped back into the crowd. Slowly, conversations resumed, fragmented, speculative. Eyes followed me now with something new, something weightier. Not admiration, not exactly, but recognition. And Cassidy? She didn't speak, not immediately. She just stared, like she'd seen a ghost, or maybe for the first time she saw me. The next morning, 9:00 a.m., sharp. I arrived at the hotel restaurant. Neutral ground. Tiled floors, soft jazz, and 4-person booths arranged under hanging lights. I chose the corner table, the one with the best sightlines. Habit, I suppose. No threat here, just parents and a sister who suddenly weren't sure what to call me anymore. Mom and Dad showed up first. He wore his pressed polo like a uniform posture, just as straight. She looked tired, but relieved, like some tension she hadn't named was finally beginning to loosen its grip. They both greeted me with small, uncertain smiles. Cassidy arrived 2 minutes later, not in uniform, but in a pale blue sweater and jeans. Civilian clothes. An olive branch. We ordered coffee. Nobody spoke until the server left. "I suppose we should talk," Dad began, voice lower than usual. "I'd say so," I replied, calm and measured. He glanced at me, then at Cassidy, and finally settled on his mug. We were surprised. "You weren't supposed to know," I said. That was kind of the point. Cassidy shifted uncomfortably. "So, you're not just writing policy memos?" "No," I said, "not just that." She studied me like she was seeing the shape of a house in the dark, trying to remember if it had always been there. "Colonel Sterling saluted you." I noticed I said a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. She flushed. "He never salutes anyone like that unless it's serious." "It was serious," I said. "He was in Istanbul, that was mine." Dad sat back. "You mean—" "I can't get into specifics," I interrupted. "You understand." He nodded. Not in frustration, not in pride, in understanding. For the first time perhaps in his life, he didn't follow up with a demand. He respected the boundary. Mom reached for my hand across the table. "You've been carrying all this alone." "By design," I said. "It's not personal, it's protocol." Cassidy's voice cracked slightly. "I made jokes. I said awful things I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I replied. "And I didn't correct you." "But why not?" she asked. "Why let me believe you were—" "Less," I finished gently. "Because that's the job. You stay invisible so the mission doesn't glow too hot. You let the heat land somewhere else. That's how you keep people safe." She nodded slowly, eyes damp but not blinking. "I was awful last night." I tilted my head. "You were. But you've also been conditioned to value one type of service over all others." "I thought mine was the hard path," she said. "It is, but it's not the only one." Dad cleared his throat. "Your grandfather, he used to say the same thing. That real service doesn't always wear a uniform." I glanced at him, surprised. He told me that once, too. We ate in silence for a while after that. Peaceful silence. The kind that comes after a storm that didn't destroy everything, just rearranged it. When we stood to leave, Cassidy paused, then turned toward me with her shoulders straightened. She saluted, not performatively, not sarcastically, but sincerely, I hesitated, then stepped forward, took her hand instead, and said, "No ranks today, just sisters." 6 weeks later, I received a private commendation in a quiet federal building that doesn't appear on any public directory. My family was granted temporary clearance to attend one time only. Mom cried softly during the ceremony. Dad stood so straight, I thought his spine might snap. Cassidy rendered a perfect salute during the citation. Then, after she hugged me, like we were finally meeting for the first time. We'd both served our country. Only now we served each other too. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to know you best? For years, I let my family think I was nothing more than a desk analyst while I operated in silence and shadows. It wasn't about revenge. It was about necessity, because some kinds of service aren't worn like a badge. They're carried like a burden. But the moment Colonel Sterling saluted me, everything changed. That single gesture forced the truth to surface, and my family, especially my sister, finally saw the person I'd always been becoming. If my story resonates with you, like this video, and subscribe for more confessional journeys that live in the gray areas of life. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, when did you finally get seen? Until next time, remember, not all service is public, but all service matters.